Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into history to uncover how one nation's battle against, well, invisible enemies has evolved over the centuries. Let's jump right in.
So how exactly has Malaysia fought infectious diseases over the years? It's a really fascinating journey, and it starts way before we knew anything about germs. Back then, the enemy, it was seen as something much more mysterious. All right, let's rewind the clock. We're starting in what we call the traditional era. And back then, the battle against sickness, it wasn't happening in sterile clinics. No, it was fought right there in the community. And it was all tied up with spiritual beliefs, nature, and really old local traditions.
So imagine a plague sweeps through a village. It wasn't just called a disease. It had a name, Bala Saroka. And this wasn't just about feeling sick. It was seen as a curse, right? A sign that something was seriously out of balance with the world. And the only way to fix it was through spiritual means, with ritual offerings and ceremonies to try and calm down these unseen forces.
And this right here really shows you the massive shift in thinking we're talking about. On one hand, you've got the traditional healer, the Bamo, who's dealing with what they believe is a supernatural curse. And on the other, the modern scientific view, where we know disease is caused by tiny germs, bacteria, viruses, you name it. It's a total pivot from trying to appease spirits to actually analyzing the physical cause.
Now, just because the beliefs were spiritual, that doesn't mean they weren't practical. Not at all. In fact, communities had this incredibly effective and surprisingly modern way of stopping a disease from spreading. It was called Pupo Kampung, which literally means sealing the village. And this was no joke. It was a serious 3-step quarantine that they were doing way back in the 1850s. Pretty amazing, right? Okay, so that was the traditional way. But then everything starts to change with the arrival of the British. This is a huge turning point. They bring in a more scientific approach to public health. But, and this is the key part, the main reason wasn't just about saving lives. It was actually driven by a really practical economic need.
In this quote we pulled from our sources, it just hits the nail on the head. The colonial government needed workers for its mines and plantations to make money, and you can't do that with a sick labor force. So disease wasn't just a tragedy, it was a threat to the bottom line. It was an economic crisis, and that is what really lit a fire under them to do something about it.
So with that economic push, you see this explosion of structured, science-based actions. Just look at this timeline. You can see how logical it was. First, in 1868, they start with quarantines for ships, right? Stop diseases from even getting in. Then they go after malaria at its source, draining the mosquito breeding grounds. And then clean water. Boom, boom, boom. This right here, this is the foundation, the very bedrock of modern public health in Malaysia.
Fast forward to 1957, independence. Malaysia inherits this public health framework from the British, but now they're in the driver's seat. And they don't waste any time. The new government immediately launches its own campaigns, basically declaring all-out war on the diseases that were causing the most harm.
And one of their biggest enemies was malaria. I mean, this was a massive crisis across the entire nation. Just to give you a sense of the scale, before they launched a national program, you were seeing more than 150,000 cases every single year. That's a staggering number. But then, look what happens when they get organized. The government launches the National Malaria Eradication Program in '67, and the impact is just wow. It's astonishing. This chart says it all. You see this huge, life-saving drop. Cases fall by 2/3 in about a decade. An incredible public health victory.
Okay, so they're making huge progress on malaria. What's next on the list? Well, the nation turns its attention to another massive threat, tuberculosis. And we're not just talking about another disease here. Our sources are clear. At the time, TB was the country's #1 killer when it came to infectious diseases.
So they launched the National Tuberculosis Control Program back in 1961, and it was this slow, steady, but incredibly successful campaign. You can see it right here in the numbers. They just keep going down, down, down. It was all about a combination of things: vaccination, finding cases early, and making sure people got treated. And it worked. They managed to cut cases by almost 2/3 over about 25 years.
All right, battle number 3 was against leprosy. And this one is fascinating because the strategy wasn't just about handing out medicine, it was a complete change in how they thought about the disease. They moved away from the old way of just isolating people forever and started integrating treatment right into the community. A really profound shift.
And did it work? Oh yeah, the results really do speak for themselves. The program kicked off in 1969, and it was a huge success. the number of patients living in the main leprosy center at Sungai Buloh dropped by more than 60%. This wasn't because people were dying. It's because they were getting treated and could finally go back home, back into society.
So we've got all these successful programs, right? Malaria, TB, leprosy, they're making real progress. But, and this is a big but, there was a huge problem lurking underneath it all. The actual laws supporting all this work, they were a total mess. Fragmented, confusing, and honestly, pretty outdated.
Think of it like this. The country was basically running on a patchwork of old colonial-era laws. It's like trying to build a modern house with a dozen different incompatible sets of old blueprints. Imagine trying to fight a nationwide epidemic when every state has slightly different rules. It just wasn't working, it was inefficient, and it couldn't last.
I mean, some of these laws were from the early 1900s. They were built for a completely different era, under a different government. They just weren't equipped to handle the challenges of a modern, independent country.
So, out of all this legal chaos came the solution. One single, powerful, comprehensive law to standardize everything. This was the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act of 1988, better known as Act 342. This finally gave Malaysia one unified legal playbook, one powerful weapon to fight disease across the entire country.
So, when you look back at this whole journey, from spiritual rituals to targeted scientific programs to finally a single unified law, it really makes you appreciate the public health systems we have today. And it leaves us with a really important question, doesn't it? As new invisible enemies inevitably pop up, what can we learn from this long, complex history to help us face the future?